Excited to have my dear friend and great beauty, Diana Clarke, here to speak about her work. We are going to run this session a little bit differently from last week, or excuse me, 2 weeks ago. So we'll have Diana read from her first book, Thin Girls, and then we will field some questions. And then around the halfway mark at 5:30, Diana will read from her new book, The Hop, which I have not read yet, which is available in June. And we put the link in the chat to pre-order that should you be so moved to do that. Just a couple words about Diana. She holds an MFA from Purdue University. Boiler up, hammer down.
Hammer down.
Always hammer down. Don't forget that part. She's also a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Utah, but is in New Zealand now. Can you say what your 1-year appointment is in New Zealand? Because I forgot.
Yeah, I'm the writer in residence at the University of Waikato.
Excellent, amazing. And as I mentioned, her first book, her debut novel, Thin Girls, came out in 2020. And just 2 years later, her second, I'm sure, brilliant book, The Hop. So whenever you're ready and want to begin reading, hit it and I will vanish. And then I'll come back and we will field some questions. Okay.
Cool. Okay, I'm just going to read from the beginning. Skipping the prologue. The group leader is showing us how to preheat. Preheat, I say. Preheat, she says. Preheat, I say. Yes, preheat. She lifts her hands into parentheses, as if she were showing us the size of a fish. Not a very big fish. A minnow, maybe. The other girls in the group follow suit, lifting hands, curving fingers, all trying to be one another. I follow along too, making brackets with my palms. I'm just trying to be like everyone else. Isn't everyone? Isn't it the impetus behind laughing when happy, crying when sad, shaking hands and bless you, how are you, good thanks, fine thanks, behind driving single file, walking down the sidewalk single file, the impetus behind wearing capris, then ripped jeans, sideburns, then bangs, behind liking ABBA, no Ariana Grande, and toe rings, and adult coloring books, and Facebook. The humanist of instincts is to follow. And the group of us, all of us, we're just trying to be human again. So we do it, we follow. Now, says the group leader, her voice meant to be calming, tender and slow as a tidal change. Imagine what might be between my hands. A chain of paper dolls, says a thin girl whose name I don't know. I stopped bothering with names after a week or two. They die or they leave. These are the options for thin girls in the facility. Not me. I've been here an entire year. It's inappropriate to think of your endurance here as an achievement, the group leader likes to tell me. I like to tell her, would you tell the pyramids of Egypt that their endurance is an inappropriate achievement? Then the group leader says something like, perhaps we should unpack the strange comparison you've made between yourself and one of the great wonders of the world. I hate to unpack. I haven't unpacked since I got here. I like the ephemeral feeling that comes with a full suitcase, the in-betweenness of it. I'm not thin enough for my body to shut down, too thin to live in the real world. I'm not dying, not living. I'm surviving. Welcome to my purgatory. I'm Rose. No, it can't be a chain of paper dolls, says the group leader, and the paper dolls of our collective imagination vanish. It has to be food, she says, pre-eating. You didn't say that when you said the rules, says Sarah, my only friend. Her eyes bag like a basset hound's, and she's younger than most of us, only 18, skin still acneed all over. I like her, Sarah. The way she pops her knuckles every hour on the hour clockwork, the way she peels tiny licks of skin from her lips, plucks her eyelashes one by one. She can't leave herself alone, as if she needs the constant reminders. This is your body. Do with it what you will. Let's just imagine it's a sandwich, says the group leader, and we all agree that there could plausibly be a sandwich between her parenthesized hands. Can you see it, says the group leader? Can you see the sandwich? I can't because there isn't one, but I do want to impress her and I do want to recover. So I nod and say, along with the crowd, Yeah, I see it. I see the sandwich. Yum. Now, I want you to try not to think about calories, she says. Don't think about the calories in this sandwich, which is easy because the sandwich is air. Think about something else, girls, she says. We were 10 years old and making paper dolls, and Lily slipped and snipped her hand with a pair of scissors, sliced right through the webbed smile that connects thumb to forefinger. Before she had time to shout out, to start crying, before she had time to mourn her new mutation, I took my own pair of scissors to my skin, closed my eyes, pinched the blades closed. The thin flesh cut easy as craft paper. I didn't cry. As we nursed our bloody wounds, our mother tutted and said, "If Lily jumped off a bridge, would you follow her then?" "Yes," I told her. There's a knock on the door to the group session room, and we all turn, invisible sandwiches suspended, mouths wide and about to bite. She's standing in the doorway, tall and thin. She looks like a streetlight. The new thin girl is wearing a top hat and a bow tie to hide her balding, her bones, respectively. She can't fool us thin girls with that gaudy getup. We've tried every trick in the book to keep our starvation to ourselves. Her eyes are rimmed with black pencil, and it makes them look cartoonish, like those animated eyes that can boing out of a skull in surprise. She's so elegantly ugly, this new thin girl, and familiar. I look around at the other sandwich holders, and they too are squinting with recognition. Her wave is a flicker of fingers. "Cat," she says. Then she licks her palm and uses it to bat at a feline ear that isn't there. "Like cat," she says. It's that, the gesture, the voice so low it crawls, that makes our eyes widen. We know this thin girl, Cat Mitchell's child star. Her song, the only one she ever released, maybe, appears like an unwanted guest. The chorus, something about falling in love with a girl. There was outcry about the sexualization of the singer, Cat Mitchell's, who was 13 and wearing golden hot pants on stage. There was more outcry about the sexual orientation of the singer, Cat Mitchell's, who called herself a lesbian on live television. "She's a kid," the people said. "How can she possibly know she's gay?" "How can your kids possibly know they're straight?" said Cat Mitchell's in a talk show interview that took over the world for a moment. Then she stuck out her tongue. It was pretty, pink, studded silver, and it drew to a point at the tip. Cat Mitchell's was so cool. You know Madonna, Mariah, Miley? Cat Mitchell's was cooler. She was the first face of hair mascara and stick-on earrings and temporary tattoos. She had her own line of tube tops that said things like "cool chick" and "bite me." She was the celebrity face of Kit Kats and released her own customized raspberry bar called the Kit Kat Mitchells. The Cat Mitchell's Barbie wore fishnets and a leather miniskirt and came with a headset microphone. And if you tugged her ponytail, she'd belt out a few robotic notes. Cat Mitchell's wore men's jackets wide open with nothing underneath. She dyed her hair neon and shone like a nightclub. She looked like a fucking Friday night. She chewed gum like it was part of her biology and blew big pink bubbles that never splattered over her face when they popped. Parents hated her. We were in love. All right, I'm going to stop right there. I don't know if that's the end of the first chapter. It might be.
That's great. Okay, I'm back. Can you see me? Oh, I meant to say, I'm sorry, I forgot to say this. For anyone watching this on their screen, you can enable closed captioning by just pressing the button on the bottom of your screen. So, sorry, I meant to say that at the top. Thank you so much for reading from your book. Do we have any questions from the audience? If so, you can type them into the Q&A. And in the meantime, I'll ask you a couple questions that I have about Thin Girls. So first of all, what was the inspiration to write about eating disorders in this way? And also the twin relationship I find so important and so moving. And the way I read it was almost like you could read that twin relationship like two parts of the same person almost. I just wonder, respond to either one of those, but what motivated you to write about eating disorders in this way? And then also, how did you come up with that construction of the twin relationship that's so central to the story?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, I'm gonna start with the first half of that question. I myself have a past with anorexia, and I always knew that I wanted to write about being institutionalized with anorexia. I didn't feel ready to write this book when I wrote it. It was still pretty raw, and I say raw, but I was really 10 years out of recovery. I guess it's maybe something that just always feels raw. But when I was going through that, I was looking to reading. I've always turned to reading to help me understand how I'm feeling about the world and about myself. And the book that I needed didn't really exist at the time. I couldn't find a book fiction that accurately painted what I was going through, what I was feeling. And so it felt really important. It felt really important to write this book. Yeah.
Writing the book you needed. I love that. Yeah.
Writing the book you needed. That's exactly what it is. And it was not therapeutic. A lot of people ask if that was therapeutic for me, if it helped me with my recovery, and it definitely did not. And I think it's something to be really careful of. Since then, I've visited a lot of anorexia recovery facilities to hold writing workshops. And a lot of women are not ready to sit down and write about their experience. And it can be a damaging thing. I think it's powerful, but it can be powerful in a damaging way, and in a way that brings to the surface all of those feelings that you are really trying to work through or squash or move away from. So you have to be really gentle with yourself. And it wasn't therapeutic to write, but it did help me gain perspective. It sort of helped me paint my symptoms onto a character who wasn't me or who had some distance from me. Let's be real, we're all writing ourselves all the time. But I was able to gain a new perspective of what I had been through, and that was a helpful thing. But on the level that is not entirely selfish when it comes to why did you write this book, I think I wanted to write about something that I was seeing in the world. I'd been closely, in close proximity of within the world, and dieting and eating disorders have always sort of felt like one of those moments, when you're sitting around a dinner table and someone says something offensive or awful and you just watch everyone tense their jaw a little bit and no one says anything. I think dieting and eating disorders has always felt like that jaw clench moment to me, where everyone wants to say something and no one says anything. And so I also wanted to write a book that filled that tension, that silence. So that's why eating disorders really.
Can I say something?
Please.
Reading your book and then listening to it on audio recently, it's to prepare for this, which you're a great voice actor, by the way.
Thanks.
I was thinking so much about how many women, I don't want to say most, but many women I know struggled with some version of an eating disorder at some point in their life, in their teens or 20s or now, and you talk so beautifully about how women's bodies are talked about, and it's like encouraged to be, it's like a sporting event, for people to comment on weight, and I think it's impossible to separate yourself from that culture, even a little bit, it's kind of, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's almost impossible to find a woman who feels sane about food, about consumption, about nutrition, and those things. And I think a lot of people who think they have it under control are often the most disordered thinkers about it. And it's hard. I was really worried about the book too coming across as a lecture or an essay, because dieting is something I felt was so insidious and harmful that it could have easily been a monologue about that. And I don't think that's very interesting. And also I think that the readers I wanted to be picking up the book already knew that stuff. I wanted the book to come from a place of wondering, which is so hard with something like dieting, because my knee-jerk response to why does dieting exist is sort of like The patriarchy. And it's not a very interesting answer. So, I wanted to dash all of that judging, all of that cynicism, and I wanted to approach the subject from a place of wondering, why do we do this to ourselves? Why does this exist? And the answers I came across while I was writing the book were actually new to me, and it wasn't just the patriarchy. I think women are so used to being seen, or not seen, actually the opposite of that. We're used to being looked at, which is an entirely different thing from being seen, right? And I think we're so used to being looked at that we either subconsciously, subliminally, something, form ourselves into objects. And we are taught that the most desirable object for us to be is a thin one. And we're taught to limit our consumption. And then dieting sort of becomes this social ritual. I remember being a kid and looking at mums who were going through like Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig. Was that a big thing in America?
Totally, yes.
Jenny Craig. And you had your special little packages that you were allowed to eat. And you calculated your calories in your little diary. And it seemed really glamorous and feminine, like this sort of rite of passage into womanness. But it's obviously disordered and so far away from the way animals or humans were ever meant to be around eating, which, keeps us alive. And it's from there, it's this slippery slope from performing dieting to this unruly anorexia, because that performance of dieting is not antithetical to existence and how we are and how we are made up. So what happens when the performance becomes us, when that performance of dieting is who we are now? And that's, I think, what anorexia is, this sort of performative act of femininity pushed to an animal thing and then pushed to a monstrous thing. And that was an interesting thing for me to come across.
Oh God. So I'm just having like flashback moments, but yeah, it's such a slippery slope. It's so easy to go from, I'm just going to minimize, this type of food. And then it can spiral so easily into truly disordered eating. Yeah. Right. Jenny Craig. Do you want to take some questions from viewers? We have a couple friends on here.
Will you read them to me?
I will. One, John Milas.
Oh, hey, John.
Asks, what advice do you have for writers who struggle with imposter syndrome?
I have imposter syndrome. First of all, I think the most important thing to remember is that, John, have you ever asked this question of a writer who has not themselves had imposter syndrome? I really don't think I've met anyone who is publishing books who doesn't have this like innate fear that they shouldn't be here and that they're fooling the whole world by getting their book published. I mean, it really feels like the biggest con of all time. And I feel like I've manipulated everyone to publish into publishing my words. And I think a lot of people feel that way. Why do we feel that way? I don't know, because I have treated books, kind of like I said earlier, I've treated books as my life for so long. And a lot of us turn to books as words of God, really. They seem like a really correct thing, especially when the internet exists and we know how much misinformation is online. You pick up a book and you do expect it to be real and true. So there's a lot of pressure when you're writing the thing that you take to be a truth. So maybe it all comes from a fear of maybe I'm not telling the truth. I don't know. Or at least I'm not telling a universal truth, and a fear that people might take that to be a universal truth. I don't know what advice to give you. I panic about it all the time. Publish your book, John. John's publishing his book.
I know. I'm very excited. The Militia House, right? Yeah. Your eyes peeled for the Militia House, 2023. So related to John's question, I mentioned this when I was, texting you, but I am interested to hear how you have been able to publish 2 novels 2 years apart. What is your strategy? Do you have a game plan when do you have like a certain amounts of hours a day that you put into it, or a schedule, or how are you so productive as a slow writer? I want to know.
I should mention that the book I'm currently working on, I'm actually incapable of writing a single word. And every time I open the Word document, I instead write a tweet or something. So I can speak to the productive version of myself that I once was, who, I should be clear, was held accountable by first an MFA program and then a PhD program where I had to turn in a number of words each week.
Mm-hmm.
So do I need a higher power holding me accountable? Maybe yes, and maybe I can't be a writer without that. But during that period when I was productive, extremely productive in a way I can't be anymore, I was waking up really early. I think it's important to find who you are in terms of your most productive time of the day. For me, unfortunately, it's so early in the morning. And I also stop having any cohesive thoughts at 11 a.m., which is in 40 minutes. So that's something for us all to look forward to.
That's so funny. I actually have my students identify the time of day where they're the most productive, because I think that's such an important thing to figure out about yourself as soon as possible. And I'm the same, unfortunately, like 5 to noon, and then done.
For me, the thing is, it's like anytime after I've slept and before 11 a.m., which makes it devastating that I am in complete control of how many words I put on the page each day, depending on when I'm willing to get out of bed. It's too much responsibility, and I can't do it. I can't do it myself. So, during those first two books, I really was waking up at the ass crack of dawn and working until lunchtime and churning out pages.
I think though too, what you said about being in the MFA program, I mean, I'm not a creative writer, but having that structure of a graduate program, I think, is ultimately really helpful, because you do have to show up with something. So there is something when you leave the program, at least for me, where you're like, oh, it's all on my schedule now. That's interesting. Well, let's see what happens. Yeah.
And if you're someone who can make up a little imaginary scheme for yourself where you're accountable to your own self, or to like an imaginary person you've created who's telling you to write 2,000 words a day or 500 words a day, whatever is your realistic word count, then that's great. But I know that I am not a good parent, even for myself. And I know that I'm not really accountable to myself, because what am I going to do? It's terrible. It's terrible. I really recommend giving yourself some discipline.
Yeah. I'm working on it. We have a great question from Bailey Wart. Was writing an anti-heroine in this book an intentional choice, or one that you retroactively realized?
That's a really good question. You know what? My editor told me that when she describes my work, she says that I'm interested in writing women who exist on the margins of transgression, which I guess is true. I write about sex workers and mentally ill queer women, but I also can't really think of a woman who wouldn't be considered on the margins of transgression. I can't think of any women I know in real life who are not transgressing every single day, because non-transgressive behavior barely exists for women. I think a lot of human animal acts, like eating or wearing pants or cutting your hair short, are considered transgressive for women. So, when something as mundane as that is considered transgressive, often more transgressive and less forgivable than a woman character who does, say, commit murder, what are we really looking at? what are we really looking at there? Because women are not only prohibited from being bad, but they're also prohibited from being humans and animals and bodies. Just the way that women characters are allowed to be flawed in narrative are really countable on a single hand, I think. You know, we know those cute character flaws that Anna Kendrick has, like she's a little bit clumsy or shy in a blushing way, or she swears sometimes accidentally. And I'm not very interested in those flaws. Love her, but I'm not very interested in those flaws because they're not very interesting. But, you know, I think when you're writing women, realistic women who are representative of the way women are, you're always going to be writing an anti-heroine, really, because women are not allowed to transgress.
That's a great question and a great answer. I agree.
It was a great question. Thank you, Bailey.
Love it. There's a question here from Sarah Daly, who asks, your book, or says, your book was so meaningful for me. Do you write a lot of short stories and poetry for inspiration?
I have to confess something to you, Sarah, and that is that I find short stories and poetry much harder than writing novels. I think there's a really big difference between a short story writer and a novelist, and I'm not even sure that those two people, some people are very talented and can do both, but I think they take such different thought processes. At least for me, I approach a novel from a place of wondering, or I try to approach a novel from a place of the unknown. And it takes me a long time, maybe I'm just not a very good thinker, but it takes me a really long time to explore and navigate that map that I didn't even know existed until I decided to write that novel. Yeah, I write about big topics. I'm interested in big topics, and I'm interested in topics I know very little about. So I set myself a whole lot of work and then give myself, 100,000 words to do that work and to make it through the subject. And usually I don't even end up with an answer to the question that I started out with, but I end up with characters doing things within that subject. And I think that if I were to sit down and write a short story about sex work, for example, which I've just spent the last 3 years of my life writing a novel dedicated to that subject, I would be so panicked by the word limit and by the page limit that I don't know that I would make any headway into the subject. I don't think, maybe I couldn't satisfy my own questions about the subject in a way that would make me feel good or like I'd done justice to the topic itself. I am so in awe of poets and short story writers and the way they manage to address something in such few pages or even words. It's incredible to me.
This actually reminds me of when I was first getting to know you in Hevelon Hall, Purdue, in the computer lab. And I said, are you a poet or are you a fiction writer? And you were like, what is a poem? Like, what even is a poem? I'm a fiction writer. Like, okay. And you're like, no, I can't do it.
I still feel that way. Not as in what is a poem, like they don't matter, but what is a poem? Yeah. And like, I'm so in awe of that art form that I'm this way with visual art too, is I just stare at it and like, am amazed that someone has been able to produce that out of their body. Yeah.
I agree. I think that constraint, being able to write beautiful poems, like I can't imagine it, honestly. It's wonderful. Wait, can we do a Roxane Gay appreciation moment? Okay, before we continue. So Clara of WGS, of the WGS program at USM asked as we were getting ready, she wanted to know, and I would like to know as well, since I didn't get to work with her at Purdue, what is it like working with Roxane Gay?
That's a really good question. And I wish John could jump in here and answer too, because John, who first asked a question, also worked with Roxane while he was writing his thesis. And I think our experiences of working with her were very different. Mine, I was about to write a book that she knew I couldn't write. I was setting out at the start of my thesis year to finish a book in a matter of, months, that I hadn't started researching, and that did not have much crossover with my life. And she basically said to me, no, you can't do that. I'm your thesis advisor and you can't do that because you're not ready. And then she said that I should write something about myself. She said, what have you been through? You've already done that research. You spent your childhood doing that research, write that. And that's how I came to write Thin Girls. And she also named the book. So, she's had a lot of influence.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And also, we were talking about productivity and having your word count done for the day. When you have Roxanne Gay, who you're answering to at the end of every week with your word count, you're going to get those words written. You just are. I was so grateful to have her as a reader. She is such a careful reader. She's a thoughtful reader, but she's also incredibly critical. And I was writing about a subject that could easily offend, hurt, injure a lot of people who have been through eating disorders, people who are fat, people who are currently dieting, people who don't realize they have a problem. The spectrum of people I could have hurt and potentially have hurt with that book is really vast. And she was such a great critical reader for those people because she was always pointing out this could cause harm, this could cause harm. And I was really grateful to have that kind of reader on my team.
Oh, that's wonderful. She's been so, just like looking from afar, so supportive of her students, which I think is amazing. And I don't think that's always the case.
Oh yeah. She's all about pulling people up to where she's at, her level. It's amazing. She's amazing.
So I will do one more question about Thin Girls, if that's okay, before we switch gears to the hop. Hannah Della Bella, the lovely Hannah Della Bella, asks, how have you dealt with the way your personal history entwines with your work, even though it's fiction? You said that it was difficult to write about the trauma, but now that the writing is done, is it any easier to talk about?
I said, after doing all of the press and publicity for Thin Girls, in which no one warned me, I would like to point out I was 25 and a baby, and no one told me or warned me against bringing up my deepest insecurities and, the dungeons of my personal history. And so I did it immediately, at my book launch, I did it. And then every piece of publicity that I did after that was incredibly invested in my experience with anorexia and what I had been through. And so if you are writing about a topic that you are not ready to talk about and not ready for people to dig into and sort of project their own experiences onto, then I would suggest writing fiction and not telling anyone that it was about yourself all along. Or not publishing a book until you are in a safe headspace that allows you to talk about your work from a distance. I think that in talking about it, this was probably the wrong way to get through these issues, but in talking about it, I have gained a much thicker skin about my own history with anorexia and with the recovery process. I do think it's one of those things that the more you communicate it, the more you write it probably, but also speak it and hear from other people about it, the more comfortable you're going to be with it and with your personal history. Another thing that I did sort of start doing halfway through my press for Thin Girls was I started talking about Rose, my protagonist, as opposed to myself. And there's a lot of myself in Rose, but in calling her as opposed to me or I could establish that sort of gorgeous distance that fiction lets us establish. But I think you can do that with a memoir too. I know Hannah Della Bella is writing a memoir right now. Exciting. I think a lot of memoirists treat the protagonist of the memoir, even though they are explicitly the self, as a character. And I think that helps a lot of memoirists, is establishing that even if it's a fake distance between the I and the body and the I on the page, to let you talk about those things, those really difficult things, to others.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. Do you want to switch gears to your new book, or do you have any closing things you want to say about Thin Girls before we switch gears?
I haven't talked about Thin Girls in like 6 months, and I kind of have forgotten how the book ends. When I sat down to do this today, I was like, oh my God, what happens in the end of that? What if someone asked about the ending? So that was terrible.
We can switch. We can move on. And I only know the little blurb that you sent about the hop. So if you want to, thank you everyone, by the way, who submitted a question. Really appreciate it. We'll have Diana read a section from the hop, and then we'll do some more questions. And if you want to just, tell us all what the hop is about, what inspired you to write it, any background information you want us to know, and then read a little section for us. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. So I haven't actually read from the hop for anyone yet, so that's very exciting. It's very exciting. This is the debut. Yeah, so the hop is about sex work. It's about legal sex work primarily, although it does speak to underground sex work too. I spent a year visiting a number of legal brothels in Nevada. I also interviewed a couple of women in the sex work industry back here in New Zealand. I spoke to people who were working underground, private escorts and dominatrixes and phone sex workers. And I think I ended up with about 300 interviews with sex workers that I then used in order to write this book. So I'm just going to read from when the character, my protagonist, arrives at the brothel for the first time. I'm just going to read for about 5 minutes. In some ways, starting at the hop felt like starting my life over. It felt like a second chance, a chance to be someone new. It was like this: 300 kilometers of desert, orange and open and flat, like driving on the sun. Then there was the hop. It was this mansion among nothingness, beautiful and unexpected, a birthmark found during a one-night stand. Coming across it felt intimate. It felt like, there you are. It felt like, I've been looking all over for you. It was easy to find, the hop was. By the time I got there, its gift shop was billboard famous. Every fifth sign along I-11, slotted between pro-life images of fetuses spiraled in wombs, advertisements for car accident lawyers, some new drug that'll cure your depression, a McDonald's burger bigger and better than their other ones, then the hop gift shop, clothing optional. A girl, arms slung over her breasts, legs spread for drivers, but instead of genitalia, there was a split pomegranate between her thighs, its insides appropriately pink and wet. I wondered how many hopeful truckers had turned in their seats, checked their rear views, fingers crossed that, for some reason, the uncensored image might be on the back. It wasn't. I checked. The back of the billboard read, "Hell is real," and 1-800-CALL-JESUS, a handy reminder for those of us en route to sin. Back home, Ma and I lived down the road from a church with a sign out front that read, "Let Jesus enter you." And every time we drove by it, Ma would shake her head. She'd say, "Not without a condom." I was trying not to think about Ma, those early days at the hop. I was trying not to, but sometimes it seemed like she was more in my head than I was. I exited the interstate and things got quiet fast. Without the road noise, the other cars, the signs, the billboards, the world felt still and bit flat and big. It was not New Zealand. In New Zealand, you existed between mountains. Back home, you were always heading towards something, an end, an edge. Here, I drove. There was a hot haze coming off the tarmac and I couldn't see the end of the highway. Here, I was heading for a vanishing point. The radio dipped into country, then pop, then a religious station with a DJ who kept saying hallelujah in between all the static. It sounded like an exorcism. There was this row of people dressed in white and standing on the corner of the Hops driveway. I slowed to pass them, to take my turn, and they turned monster. They yelled through my window, called me a sinner, and held up signs that read, "Keep Nevada brothel free." One of them said, "You're going to hell." And another one, a child wearing a red baseball cap and a white t-shirt that read, "No more whores," shouted right at my face, "Slut." The word, that one, it was always a slap, but I'd been hit by it a million times. I leaned as far out my window as I could and shouted, "Jesus told me he thinks you're ugly." I didn't know much about the Bible. I didn't even know if Jesus and God were the same person or not. And whenever I asked someone about it, their answer was too slippery to hold. Once I went to a Halloween party dressed as the Holy Ghost because Ma and I didn't have any bed sheets the moths hadn't gone to. This woman, maybe the kid's mother, she screamed, "You'll pay for your sins." And I had to laugh at that because I wouldn't pay for my sins. I'd get paid for them. The Corolla gagged and stalled and gave up entirely 100 meters from the Hops' front door. I cranked the key in the ignition, but there wasn't even a splutter, so I shouldered my backpack. I'd started out packing real luggage, trinkets, framed photos, a bunch of Mars stuff. But looking at it all, barely filling a suitcase, it was depressing. My whole humanity was cabin-sized. I dragged my old backpack from the closet instead. I decided on necessities only. I was alone. Why would I want to bring more of myself, my sad self, than I needed? It was my chance to start over. There were 5 white painted steps leading up to the Hops' wraparound porch. It was decorated with rocking chairs, side tables, hanging baskets filled with pink flowers, a dollhouse straight out of a fairy tale. If you didn't know it was a brothel, the place could have been a candy store. No one was sitting outside because it was hot, so hot. I was glad they weren't. I was never good with first impressions, but I was good with other impressions. Ma could do a great John Travolta. I could do a decent Olivia Newton-John. Sometimes we reenacted the final scene from Grease, the one where Sandy transforms her entire self into something Danny might want to be with. "You're the one that I want," we sang to each other, shaking our shoulders in time. I loved that scene. Thought it was romantic how much Sandy was willing to change to be with John Travolta. Ma clicked her tongue about that. "You don't change who you are for any man, Bunny," she told me, especially not a Scientologist. Okay, I'm gonna stop right there.
That made me laugh. You didn't catch it because I was muted. Okay, so we'll open it up to questions again. Let's see. I'd love to just hear again the like why, what was inspiring to you about writing about sex work?
Yeah, sex work is such a super fascinating industry to me still for countless reasons, but one of them is the fact that it is an industry that is largely populated by women, while also being an industry that women are not really allowed to be in according to the majority of the population, which feels in a lot of ways like a distilled version of what femininity feels like a lot of the time, which is a set of contradictions about what is desirable and what is repulsive, and the way that these two charges can shift and change from day to day and minute to minute, the way that our literal body parts, thighs, chests, are considered desirable one day and repulsive the very next, and the way that traits like swearing, like smoking, are sexy in one scene and then disgusting in another. So sex work functions socially in a pretty similar way to that, I think, and that 99.9% of sex workers are women, and that 99.9% of these women's clients are men, but also that 99.9% of men would absolutely never date a sex worker. And so it's this space of ultimate contradiction. There's like this economic flaw in supply and demand there, because exactly that which is desirable for one purpose is refused for another. And I find that space, that really charged space of total contradiction, so rich with potential to explore, because there are no hard and fast answers there. Everyone second guesses themselves at every turn because there's this ongoing tussle, friction between desire and social rule. Yeah, so the story really wrote itself because there was so much energy in that space socially out there in the world, but also at the brothel itself. There's so much friction.
What did you find when you visited the brothel? Like, did you do interviews or just,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, no, I did.
I
I did a whole, but I found a lot of things at the brothel. I found out that I was more prudish than I realized I was. I also found this like incredible community. I don't know what I expected before I got there on my first visit. I primarily did my research at the Moonlight Bunny Ranch, which is the brothel that this TV series Cat House is based on, if anyone is familiar. It's really old now, and probably no one is familiar. Yes, I did most of my research there, and I spent maybe 3 weeks there in total, conducted interviews with most of the workers. They have 75 women living on site, and I did interviews with most of them, and was even able to follow some brothel workers around as their like shadow for a couple of sessions. So it was fascinating. I think what I mostly found was this incredible sisterhood. These girls were best friends, and they had houses together off site in Vegas, in California, where they owned property together and went and visited and went on vacations together. And they were really, truly a community. And I don't know if it's because of my own misogynistic predisposition or whatever, but I had anticipated jealousy. I had anticipated finding competition, because I guess I can't really picture a workplace that exists without people in competition with each other and vying for each other's jobs, you know, the disaster that is capitalism. But these women are lining their bodies up in a room and having guests choose them out of that line. They're in almost as direct competition with each other as you can imagine, but are still able to find this incredible sense of community and sisterhood. It was amazing. It was amazing to me.
That is, yeah, as someone who knows nothing about that world, that is surprising.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, I don't know, you know, you don't need to answer this if you don't want to, but what do you think about the conversation, the public discourse around decriminalizing sex work? Where do you stand on that? And did your research change or shape your view around it at all?
I think the criminalization of sex work is this condemnation of an extremely lucrative and woman-dominated industry. And by criminalizing sex work, the industry's success is capped, and its workers' accomplishments are both limited and stigmatized to the extent that any victory is equally a point of shame. It keeps workers afraid for their lives and their livelihoods. It keeps them unsafe and unhealthy and isolated. And I think, you know, there is talk about sex work and sex trafficking as though the two are inevitably connected. But I think that's to ignore the fact that the reason the two are connected is because both are illegal, when one absolutely shouldn't be. I think it's been proven that the most effective way of reducing sex trafficking is to legalize and regulate sex work, not to criminalize it. But because legalizing sex work would require allowing women bodily autonomy, instead further restrictions are imposed, despite this being the less efficient way around the issue. In the women I interviewed, the difference between legal sex workers and illegal sex workers was so vast. Legal sex workers were getting access to weekly healthcare, contraceptives, education, safety, security, and for a lot of the part, fair pay, which isn't to say that these women aren't afraid. They are afraid, but mostly not because of their work or their clients, but because of this always impending fear that their jobs might become illegal again and put them back underground. Whereas illegal sex workers, the women I spoke to working on the streets in Vegas, for example, or private escorts, they were afraid of being arrested and hurt and raped and killed. Really, the only fear that these two groups of women, legal sex workers and illegal sex workers, had in common was the fear of the industry being criminalized further and being imprisoned for their choice of work.
And were they, it sounds like they were, but were these women very open with you about their experiences?
Yeah, they were, for the most part, incredibly open and generous with their stories. I actually faced a lot of criticism. I didn't realize how off my own thinking about the subject was for a long time. I was asking the question with my first set of questions that I brought into my first round of interviews. I asked this question about how sex work altered the sex workers' romantic lives with their partners, which I initially thought would be, it was one of my first thoughts. It was how are these women able to sustain romantic relationships outside of their work if they're having sex for a living? And then one legal brothel worker said to me that the answer to the question is probably the one I'd expect, that it does significantly alter her romantic life and her intimacy. She said, I can't remember the exact phrasing, it was amazing. Something like, the fact that you expected it is part of the problem. Yeah, the fact that you expected it to be a problem is part of the problem, because as long as people like you have expectations like that, the expectations will keep being correct. Yeah, so, you know, I'm an asshole because having those expectations is imposing those expectations on sex workers. And while people hold those expectations, it is going to self-fulfill. Yeah, so that was really interesting for me. But for the most part, these women were so open with their stories and shared their entire lives with me. And I really owe the entire book to them and those conversations.
That's incredible. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has their own ideas about sex work, you know, their own ideas. I'll just say that, you know, and so it's probably impossible to come in to that conversation like as a completely, you know, perfect interviewer, you know, because you have your own ideas about it.
Yeah.
Incredible. Okay. Wow. I'm thinking about these interviews. It's amazing. Oh, wait, one more question before I read this one. How long did you have this process of interviewing sex workers for your book?
It was about a year before I even wrote a sentence of the novel. So I was pretty sure it was a subject I wanted to explore. I was about to say virgin. I felt like virgin to the subject. You get in that mind space. I was completely naive. I had no idea. I was ignorant about the industry, about the women who were working in the industry. And I knew I had to do research. And I was also fully aware that doing research might mean that I couldn't write the book. I might get to the point in research where I felt like I wasn't the right person to be putting those words on the page or writing those characters or exploring that world. And that point came multiple times. I think, you know, there were a number of days where I closed my laptop and I thought, this isn't actually my book to write. But the more I researched and the more I spoke to these women, the more I felt like it was a story that had to be told. So I'm still sort of at war with myself about that, about like, this is a story that should be told, who should tell this story. But I did do hordes and hordes of research. I crashed my last laptop with all of my notes from this novel and dictated interview answers and video chats that I had to record and all of that. Yeah, I ended up with so much material that the hardest part of writing this book was finding one character to follow throughout the book and one story to tell, because she couldn't have experienced everything that all of those 200, 300 women had been through. And all of their stories were so fascinating.
So you talked to hundreds?
Hundreds, yeah. I think it was over 200. I'm not sure if I got to 300. Yeah.
That's incredible. That's so interesting. I want to, some other time, I want to like read some of the raw footage and interviews.
Oh, you can
so
have it.
I want to. So a question from Kelsey that we only have a few minutes left, so we'll get this one in under the wire. Related to establishing voice for your characters. How do you establish voice for different characters? How do you get to know them?
That's a really good question. Voice, I think voice is something I can be least helpful about because it's the thing that comes most naturally to me. Something that really doesn't come naturally to me, for example, is plot. And so I have all of these responses I can regurgitate to you about plot from craft books that I've read to teach myself how to do plot. But voice is like the one innate thing for me. Voice comes to me before anything else comes to me. So I start getting voices in my head. And then I try to get those voices down on paper, sounding almost exactly like they do in my head, because they do sound like real organic people when they happen up here. They sound like a crazy person.
No.
For the Hop in particular, I have a cast of, I think 20 people speak in first person. It's set as a series of interviews. So 20 people speaking out from the page in first person. And a lot of those voices, when they came to me, did sound similar because a lot of experiences with the sex work industry are similar. And a lot of those women ended up sounding the same in terms of when they spoke about the politics of the industry, about the criminalization, about a lot of things. They had very similar things to say. And so it was important to me to find their distinctions, despite the fact that they were saying often similar things. How do you develop voice? How do you make a voice distinct from another voice? I really recommend this. I think this is a poetry exercise, Kels. Was it Kelsey Watt who asked the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like it was Dawn who told me to go out into the world and sit down and eavesdrop on conversations that are happening around you. And I did that for a long time and I found interesting topics, but what I wasn't copying down into my phone, I was copying down like, this guy keeps losing his socks or something, which is an interesting little anecdote, whatever. But what you're not taking down is his voice, is the way he's speaking and when he's pausing and when he's making errors and when he's saying and ah. And I think those things are really important to write down in the eavesdropping activity. So hold on, someone.
Oh my God. How dare you?
Yes, I've got a book. I'll be out. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh wow, we gotta wrap it up.
That's right, wrap it up.
Oh my goodness. I could talk to you for 1,000 hours, but keep going. Finish.
Basically, I would say that when you sit down and write the way people are talking, actually listen to the way people are talking and write down the ums and ahs and write down where they go off track and start talking about something different and try to get those natural intonations that we often erase when we write fiction. Because we write the way we hear dialogue on TV, which is a sort of perfected version of that. And I think there's beauty in raw dialogue too. I think there's beauty in the way people actually talk. And there's so much communicated in those small errors that are great when they come across on the page.
Great question and great answer. Thank you so very much. It's 6 o'clock. Here.
Thank you for having me. It's so fun to be virtually in Maine for a while.
I know, you have to come for realsies soon.
I will. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming and for your questions. They were amazing.
Thank you, everyone, for the questions. And also, Clara has put the link to pre-order the Hop in the chat if you want to click on that really quickly and buy Diana's new book. I'll give you 2 seconds to do it now. Thank you again so very much. I adore you. And I'm going to text you as soon as we log off.
Thank you, Carrie. I better get out of here before I'm forcibly removed.
Yeah, get out of there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Everyone.
Okay.